All right. Welcome. Thank you to all those who've come to this session. Um, the session is, of course, talking about migration under climate change. My name is Chandni, and I'm sort of just shepherding this lovely in person panel to talk about migration and climate change. We will be, while climate change and migration are two big things that are happening, I guess, we are also locating it within the story of broader rural to urban transitions. And that's why, I mean, this group of wonderful speakers and panelists are going to be talking both from rural and urban areas. If I can just have the slides up, please. Just to set the context, I guess, migration, of course, isn't new. And yes, people have always been on the move, and climate change is exacerbating both the reasons why people are moving and then the conditions under which they move. Simultaneously, while people are moving, there's the urban transition underway, and many more people are expected to be living in urban areas. So, climate change both intersects with lives and livelihoods at source areas where people are coming from, but also where people come in and reside in. And of course, although many of us are people who work on climate change, we also always forefront the fact that there are development realities within which we should be looking at climate change. So stories of unemployment, weak female labor force participation, the growing story of agrarian distress and aspirations that are moving away from farm-based livelihoods, and of course then the reality of a large informal economy even when people move. And so apart from all of this, I know I've already said a lot, but then apart from these fluxes that we are seeing, there are also newer waves of different types of transitions around digitization, shifts in how and where infrastructure is growing, and the gig economy, and so on. So, this is just really to set the context to the story of flux and change within which we will then in this panel look at different forms of moving and staying. I also want to take an opportunity to say that this panel is part of the CLARE program, a project that we are doing at IIHS with a whole host of institutions. You can see those logos there called Climate Change Local Adaptation Pathways, or CLAPS. There's a website if you're interested in looking at it. And what we're trying to ask or answer, hopefully, in this project on which is called CLAPS is, first, how can we imagine and reimagine rural and urban futures to acknowledge and support both the act of moving or mobility and the act of staying? And I struggle to use the word immobility because it sort of takes away agency from people, and maybe Sheetal will talk a bit about that later. But the act of staying and moving, given this reality, how can we think and reimagine rural and urban futures? That's the first question. And the second question is, of course, around how do you both simultaneously think about building a strong floor of good development and then think about enabling climate resilience when mobility is, the reality uh, of people living in India. And so we have a wonderful set of speakers. I will go through each of them, I think, as and when you all come. And then, of course, we have Manuela and Aryan coming to us as discussants who will sort of reflect on these, but also give some of their own inputs. And then I'll open it out. So we have slightly longer presentations than have taken place in other panels. And then we'll move to the discussants. And then, of course, to the audience, both online and offline. And with that, I guess we can start with the first presentation from Anurag and Sundar Babu from Work Fair and Free. We'll be talking about work from Tamil Nadu. Yes.
Thank you.
And you can switch on your mic.
Yeah. Hello. Thank you so much, Chandni, and thanks to IHS for this opportunity. So, as Chandni was mentioning, our work is also situated to kind of document the flux in Dharmapuri, which is a district in Tamil Nadu. And I'll just quickly run through why we chose the district and what was the larger questions that we went through when we started off the project. And and then move on with the presentation. Just to say, this is the district map. Dharmapuri is a northwestern district in Tamil Nadu, and it has 6 talukas, which is like the revenue and this thing, and 8 blocks, 8 administrative blocks. Initially, when we started off the project, the only larger questions was to try and understand what is the kind of migration patterns and pathways that emerge out of the district. Because Dharmapuri as a district has had a history of long-term migration into Karnataka, especially Bangalore, and within other districts in Tamil Nadu, Tirupur, Erode, Coimbatore, and things like that. Especially the story of Bangalore is situated in the time period when Bangalore was developing in the initial period of the IT revolution, 1960s, 70s, when buildings were being made. So a lot of construction workers started coming in. So we just wanted to document this story and see what are the new patterns, new emerging patterns, and what are the new things that are emerging from the district. It was at this point when we started doing scoping into the district and figured out that there is a lot more that could be talked about, and within migration and within the rural transition that is happening. And that is when we also understood that there is a very clear kind of role that climate change plays in the movement of people from Dharmapuri to other places, to urban places. So moving on, just to give a brief and quick overview of the district, Dharmapuri is characterized as a semi-arid district with very low average annual rainfall. And this especially is very low during the peak sowing period, which is between February to March, February to April. It's less than 200 millimeters. Again, studies shows us that it's not only decreasing rainfall that has caused dryness in the region, but there is also a presence of increasing land surface temperatures. And that is also during the period of a long decade from 2006 to 18, that the study shows that there has been an increase in the land surface temperatures. Again, we also see that these two factors of decreasing rainfall, aridity, dryness, and increasing land surface temperatures has caused a direct adverse effect on the yield, on the agricultural yield that comes up. In a district where around 40% of the population is dependent on agriculture for their livelihood. And again, the one unique thing about the district is also that the topographical changes as we move from one taluka to the other, or one block to the other, or even one village to the other, has profound effects in how climate change affects the region. I'll just give a small example where there are regions in the district which are situated on a particular elevation, which then means that water cannot, there is no water retention. So for agriculture, it becomes very difficult because all the rainwater then runs down. There are other regions which are flat, dry, and its agriculture is just not possible because there is no water. So these are the kind of different the things that we see as in when we talk about topographical changes. Again, Dharmapuri has been one another reason why we also wanted to see what is happening in the district is that throughout history, it has been kind of documented as one of the most backward districts in Tamil Nadu. And this is where we see the larger state narrative being kind of offset, because Tamil Nadu as a state we see is largely a state that sends migrants to other places within India and also internationally. And then we also see that within this whole narrative, Dharmapuri features as the top 10 out-migrating districts, as Irdirajan and others have documented in their study. So I'll just quickly move on to I'll come back to the historical the aspects that I mentioned about caste and gender-based violence. It'll feature later in the story. But again, backward, when I say it's also very low performing on social indicators, low education literacy levels, low sex ratio, and things like that. Now I just want to move into the rural transition bit. Our work currently, this is an ongoing study. We just recently completed the data collection process in the beginning of this month, and we have predominantly worked in the in the rural side, in the source side, and the documentation of the urban kind of transition is still something that we are just starting off. So I'll just focus on the rural transitions and how the flux in the rural source regions are pushing migration or pushing people out. So one of the major reasons is, as we can see, that extreme climatic conditions were observed in the past year. These are two newspaper cuttings that I've just put in the PPT, where you can just see that the top one was in April of 2024. Which says that it was drought prone, and it was dry, and the farmers collectives there were trying to approach the state to say that please declare the district as drought prone. And then just cut to 8 months later in December, around 2,000 hectares of farmland in Dharmaburi was inundated because of floods, because of the Fengal cyclone. This is the extreme conditions of climate change that we can observe in the district right now. Again, one more issue of climate change is the human-animal conflict that we see predominantly affecting agriculture in the district. Is that the dryness in the forest is forcing animals to come down into the fields. There is a lot of issues of peacocks, wild boars, monkeys, and other animals destroying crops. And then farmers then have to kind of fight for compensation, which is a long process. It's a long issue. We will not get into that right now. Again, there is a huge caste based the hierarchies that exist in social, socioeconomic statuses affect employment opportunities for people within the source region itself. People cannot get into employment because they come from a certain caste, so they are pushed again to go out and seek for other opportunities. Again, Dharmapuri as a district has had a long history of caste-based violence and gender-based violence, which has affected, which has resulted into the backwardness also. And again, we also see that we'll come back to that, but caste also plays a very important role in how people migrate or where they choose to migrate. Again, in Narega, which is supposed to be a scheme that helps rural employment, has also failed because these schemes are controlled by dominant caste people, then which makes it very difficult for Dalits and other marginalized people to avail that opportunity and find employment. So this is an image that we just gathered from the field in December, which shows waterlogging in the fields. It would be really hard for people to imagine here that these fields in April were completely dry, and crops were destroyed because of dry aridity. And now you see that they are being destroyed because of waterlogging. Moving on, again, there are other factors that kind of affect rural transition. One of the main one of the other reasons is the low wage rates that exist in the source region, be it in let's say industry or construction or other such sectors. Then again, we see that there is the huge issue of debt that has come up in our study, that we have observed in our study, and a generational debt, as we can see it across communities, across different people coming from different backgrounds, and most of the debt is accumulated because of conspicuous consumption patterns, as we see, because in certain cases what happens is people who migrate to certain locations, and when they come back to the source, they tend to spend a lot to showcase their social status, or at least kind of prove to the people in the community that they have attained certain socioeconomic mobility through migration. And for that, they tend to spend on festivities by taking loans, for which they again have to then come back to the destination region and migrate and work. So that's also another thing that we have seen. Again, so these transitions that are happening in the rural areas force people to migrate. And again, as I've said, Dharmapuri is one of the top 10 out migrating districts. And we also see that migration becomes a factor of the social, financial, and habitat capital, as we say, which basically is the amount of land holding that people have, or the kind of area that they come from. Because certain caste, people who come from certain caste will have certain exposure, will have certain kind of experiences that help them not only in the source but also in the destination, which is and the figure that I have here is kind of an example of that, wherein in a certain taluka we see that Vanniers and Kaundars, who are the dominant caste people in the district, have a distinct kind of pathway where they go to Coimbatore for as construction workers and skilled construction workers as maestries or things like that. And this map is a little incomplete because we also see that they, after they move to a certain location, they tend to stay on there, and it is their caste network that also helps them to stay on there for a longer time. And we also see that it's uh, the next generation was also benefited because they then get uh, access to education, better institutions, and better work. So that's also one thing that we have seen. Moving on, again, the migration is mostly single male seasonal migration. People mostly move to the construction sector either in Coimbatore or Bangalore, depending on their space where they are located within the district. If Bangalore is closer, they'll come to Bangalore. If Coimbatore is closer, they'll go there. There's also some migration that happens to Tirupur in the garment industry. So I've not had the, because as I said, it's still very initial stages of our study, and we have just collected data from the field. But some of the data that we have that I want to share is around in around 45% of the households that we kind of surveyed in 3 blocks, we figured out that at least one member of the family was employed in another district or state as a casual wage labor, mostly in the construction sector. Coming back to the debt issue, we see that around 50% of the households that we surveyed, we surveyed around 150 households in 3 blocks. So around 50% of the households that we surveyed, which is around 85 households, reported that they have some loan that is outstanding, and it's from SHGs or legal money lenders. Or a local money lender, sorry, and then they are paying an amount of rupees 3 to 10,000 as monthly interest, and the principal amounts is huge. It goes to around 3 lakh rupees this is something that is it'll keep growing. So because as I said, it's generational. So the 3 lakh for this generation can become 10 to the next, and it keeps increasing. So the entire lifespan of a migrant worker just goes into repaying debts. All the remittance that is being sent to the source goes into repaying debt and to just for everyday survival. That's also something that we got to know from our survey data. Yeah, so I think that's mostly what I wanted to share. But the one thing that I wanted to add on is that the issue of debt is something that is causing a real kind of flux situation in the district, where people are forced to move. And there we also see that there are certain communities in the district who go to, let's say, Kerala in the timber industry to do wood cutting jobs, which pay very good money. It's around 3 to 3,500 rupees a day for a daily wage worker. But even those people are in debt, and the debt amounts are like high, 6 lakh, 7 lakh rupees. So yeah, that is the larger kind of findings that we had at this moment. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Anurag. And thanks to sticking to time. I just want to check, do you want to add anything we can have? All right. So what we're going to try and do is, please note down your questions, but let's hold till the end so that we hear all these stories from rural urban transitions, and then we sort of have the discussants, and then have a longer discussion around this. So do note your questions for Anurag and Sundar Babu. All right. Moving on to Sheetal and Aisha, they'll be presenting work from across 3 states, actually, Orissa, Karnataka, and Kochi in Kerala, traversing both rural and urban spaces, source and destination areas. Over to you all.
Thanks, Chandni, and thanks to everybody for being here. My name is Sheetal Patil. I work with SES, School of Environment and Sustainability at IIHS. I'm joined by Aisha. We will be both together talking about migration as an adaptation to climate change, where we will discuss the emerging insights across the mobility spectrum. Uh, as Chandni has also opened up the conversation by saying that, how climate change is threatening the livelihoods and habitability. Lots of studies, especially those by climate scientists, on relationship between environmental change and migration, tend to lean towards environmental migration and presuming that it is a problem to be solved all across. And whereas the migration researchers often take the viewpoint of migration as adaptation. These studies underline the agency of migrant and their capacity to proactively respond to the hazards as well as initiatives to adapt. So, taking on that kind of a understanding and contextualization of migration and climate change, we argue that mobility or migration needs to be understood as a spectrum, not only of geographical locations, like source and destination, but also the type of movement, the agency over mobility decisions, and who takes it, and all that, as they result in different states ranging from involuntary immobility to forced kind of a migration. Uh, that's why we argue and we foresee that the migration for adaptation is a very remittance focused till now. Now, evolution of successful kind of adaptation should take place across the mobility, immobility spectrum, which is across destination and source. Um, so, looking at the source of the source part of the mobility spectrum, what we do is no problem. Looking at the literature that what mobility is defined as, they say that population is affected by environmental risk and lack of capacity to migrate away from worsening the conditions, calling such population as trapped or immobile or not able to move. Where those living in most environmentally risky locations are also the poorest with the least resources to physically move away from this risk, which exacerbates their vulnerability altogether. However, there is also an acknowledgement that labeling people or population as trapped affect the agency and possibly the rights of individuals to make their own decisions to stay. And perhaps terms such as non-migrants or stayers are less value-laden, thus highlighting the need to understand why people choose to stay despite environmental challenges is very eminent to do. Literature also notes that various terms are there to refer to non-migrants or immobile people. Something like non-migrant, stayers, left behind, immobile, trapped, and so on, which indicate different types of non-movements and where levels of agencies also change through with this kind of a nomenclature. Um, Looking at the our context of immobility, we were still looking at immobility, but now I'm coming to say that why we call them as stayers. We are looking at the outcome of successful adaptation, as Chandni was saying, that the goal is to look at the matrix to develop migration as a successful adaptation in the spectrum. So agency emerges as an important determinant. Thus, we need to shift the language from traditional immobility to emerging resilient stayers or local adapters. That is why we are calling them as stay, the process of staying, or people who are staying as stayers, or the activity of staying. The study sites here we are locating in south of Odisha in 3 districts and north of Karnataka in 3 districts. Here in this presentation, I will talk mostly about Odisha. And what is the emerging typology of stayers? Because stayers also has this kind of a framework which can be used to categorize them into different classes, which is based on aspiration and capability framework, which defines what is the capacity to move or what is the aspiration to move or stay. That is where we can see the 2 classes, voluntary staying and involuntary staying. But also there is another pattern of movement where we say that or staying, where we say that there are full stayers or partial stayers or seasonal and partial stayers, where it is based on the people in the household who decide to stay or who decide to move, and for how long. There is a temporality to that staying and moving part also. In Odisha, we see the climate vulnerability very looming because the state is influenced by southwest and also retreating northeast monsoons. Sea level rise, cyclones, extreme droughts, heat waves are very rampant in the state, and the changing weather patterns not only affecting the livelihoods but also lots of lives in the state. Between 75 and 11, the state was impacted by 12 major cyclones, including one super cyclone in 1999. Also, the reports say that about 33,000 square kilometers of the area of the state is vulnerable to flooding. Apart from that, heat waves and droughts are also recurrent in the state. Where we started looking at the mapping of the immobility or staying in the state was through the geospatial method, where we looked at the 14 different variables and their relationship with people's decision to stay or move. And these variables, we gave them the equal weightages through the different categories and tried to map the immobility through that index. And where we saw that in the blocks where we wanted to study, they were into high, medium, and low immobility kind of an index. The maps show that with the geospatial method, we got the different cluster of villages which were falling in high, medium, and low immobility index. But when we, on the ground, when we did the house listing, we saw the proportion of households which were immobile in a different kind of a pattern, which shows that if the previous table we see, equal weightages may not work even in the blocks, across the blocks also. So that is one of the findings, that biophysical characteristics as well as the socioeconomic features determine the people's decision to move or stay. Coming to the climate risks in Orissa and in North Karnataka, because we also did some of the scoping visits in North Karnataka. So we see that the parched land due to delayed monsoon in North Karnataka or precarious living conditions in Kandhamal in Odisha, or how people were finding it difficult to dry turmeric because of the untimely rains in Kandhamal, which is actually a very significant crop in that region. Um, then there were also adaptation kind of initiatives by individuals or by NGOs or other collectives, where we saw the improved goat sheds in Gajapati district, where they said that if there was a not improved shed, there would have been a lot of mortality in their goats. Also, crop diversification and value addition in other districts of Odisha, but also livelihood diversification through remittances. Like, what happens when the remittances come, people buy these kind of auto rickshaws or vehicles to give on rent and earn some income from that. These are some anecdotal kind of quotations which say that, how people were kind of finding ways to adapt to the risky climatic situation. People also talked about place attachment, because of which they were not able to move. And they said that because of all these reasons, we are not able to move because we have a small patch of land, we can do turmeric cultivation, which gives us the cash income. But also we can do a shifting cultivation in the plots near the forests, which we can see on the right side where the maize was sown very recently there. And also people say that we invest all our surplus money into the assets and many different things in our own area. So we are really attached with the place where we want to stay. There are also government and institutional support for the staying population, where we see that lift irrigation for agriculture in some of the districts, some SSG members doing jackfruit nurseries because people were doing agroforestry and agroforestry through horticulture crop in their land, and also there was some apiculture by SSG members in Ganjam district. These are some pictures about how the government also were having some initiatives on water conservation, micro irrigation, and diversification through different cash crops in these regions. So staying in the context of migration has a lot of linkages with moving itself. Remittances, both financial and cultural, were visible. Some of the times we saw that there is a enabling of use of improved use of resources, living conditions, health and education status, and adaptive capacity as well in the staying populations. There were also anecdotes about how women empowerment also takes place, because decision making at household, farm, and community level was with them, because the men were mostly migrating. It also reduces inequality and vulnerability, is what we thought of. Yeah. And shift from the purely agrarian and mixed economy at a household level. And I was also reminded in the last point where Aro was talking yesterday about transition is complex, but imagination of pathways of adaptive transition will define the nature and success of outcomes of these migration patterns. So this is to just show the picture of where South Odisha and North Karnataka people who are staying, where are they actually migrants from certain households, where they are moving, why they are moving, what is the climate change risk, and what is the adaptation potential. I'm not going to go into a lot of detail into it, but I'll ask Aisha to take it over from here.
Uh, uh, so I'll be talking about the other end of the spectrum at the destination. So for destinations, we have taken two of the biggest migrant destinations in southern India, that is Bangalore and Ernakulam. So the reason for that is, if you are looking at the last census in 2011, it was observed that 4 in 10 people in Bangalore are actually migrants. And there are different kinds of migration that is happening to Bangalore. There is, of course, the more formal white collar migrants that are coming into sectors like IT, but there is a significant amount of migration that is happening into informal sectors and informal settlements. So that is where we are focusing on, mostly in construction, domestic work, waste work, gig work, etc. And in terms of the migration corridor, just like Sheetal is looking at North Karnataka, so that North Karnataka to Bangalore is a major migration corridor. But at the same time, there is also other migration that is happening from neighboring states like Tamil Nadu, Andhra Pradesh, and also more distant states in northern and northeast India, for example, West Bengal, Odisha, and Assam. So the other destination, that is Ernakulam. So we took stick to destination districts because it's not just cities. They are actually spreading across almost these districts, Bangalore and Ernakulam, and urbanization is rapid in both districts. So in Ernakulam, we have almost 6.3 lakh migrant workers according to the 2017-18 count. And this is there is a huge demand for migrant workforce because of the vacuum created by out migration from Kerala and Kerala's whole population. And it almost 57% of the total workforce in Ernakulam district is migrants. So and they are heavily required in sectors like construction, plywood, which is a major sector that is solely dependent on migrants, and as well as there is other sectors like restaurants and manufacturing that employ migrants a lot. So in terms of corridor, of course there is a major corridor from Odisha to Kochi, but also from West Bengal and Assam to certain parts of Ernakulam, and from nearby states such as Tamil Nadu. So talking about the sorry this one, yeah. Yes, okay. Yeah. So when we are looking at the period of residence of these migrants in the destination, other large scale studies that have been conducted in both cities and urban areas have found that mostly migrants tend to stay 1 to 4 years, and that is then they prefer to kind of go back to their destination. So I just have to say that this is a preliminary kind of study. What we are doing is mostly looking at literature, but also what has been the studies that have been done, because both cities have a rich history of study on migration that has happened. And then we have done a lot of scoping, and we have kind of identified settlements where migrants are significantly there, and are kind of developing profiles on these settlements in terms of their access to infrastructure, services, and their exposure to hazards at the destination. So, talking about migrant housing in Bangalore, so previous studies have found that half of the residents in informal settlements are migrants. But then, if you are looking at the kind of migrant housing and migrant settlements, we found that there is a lot of heterogeneity, which is evident within the settlement itself, but across settlements as well. So if you are looking at younger migrant settlements, so in younger, we are saying maybe 10 to 15-year-old, 5-year-old. So that is the range that we are considering as younger migration settlement. So these pictures, 3 pictures are from the same settlement, and it shows how varied the kind of housing that they have in the settlement. So if we are looking at one cluster, which is the North Karnataka migrants who are predominantly in the construction construction sectors, they build their own houses, and it's mostly tents that are exposed to, if there is a water logging, need not be a flood even, it could be just a water logging after rain, and they are exposed to these kind of issues. Then we see Bengali migrants who are in the waste work sector. So we see that these houses are constructed by the thekedar, who gives them in exchange for the labor that they provide by collecting the waste. So that is mostly tin sheet or cement sheet housing, which is heavily exposed to heat. So that is one of the hazards that we see in these clusters. Then of course there are others, more pakka kind of housing that has been built explicitly for renting out to migrants, single male migrants. So these usually may be male migrants who are working in gig work, or some similar kind of security work, or housekeeping, etc. And there is also heterogeneity across temporal scale. So we are also looking at older migrant settlements, 50 to 100-year settlements, and what is the kind of situation there. So there people are owning land, they have built houses over time, so it's more haphazard, it's not like one big pakka building, but as they accumulate capital at their destination, they build these houses over time. So in terms of migrant housing in Ernakulam, this is more recent, the migration. So and the income coming from the rent is a major income source for the locals there. So what they have done is that they have repurposed their houses, their shops, or even built the bare minimum houses that they can give out for getting rent as an income. So we see that in these houses that have been repurposed, there are 15 to 20 migrants who are living in very close crowded conditions, and 5 to 6 migrants in a room, or in wholesale market shops where there is no ventilation and the migrant is just staying inside and acting as kind of a security for the shop owner at night. Then we looked at what is the accessibility to facilities and services. So if you're just looking at, I'm just talking about case of Bangalore. So if you're looking at Bangalore, this is a map of the BWSSP pipe water network in Bangalore, and the red dots represent the informal settlements in Bangalore. So we are seeing that as the city is developing, most of these migrants are being pushed to the periphery, and that is where the significant amount of informal settlements with migrants are there, and they don't have access to good quality water supply. Similarly, in terms of access to toilet amongst migrants in Bangalore, we see that there is a huge percentage that is actually dependent on open defecation and shared or public toilets. So this is, again, we saw the same situation in when we are going to do the profiling of settlements, people going after work to across settlements to collect water, or the shared toilets, what is the kind of facility that they have in their settlement of shared toilets. The next thing that we looked at, what is the social security schemes and protection, because that is again a big safety net for these migrants when climate hazards happen. So what we see is that they face significant barriers in accessing these schemes, basically because they are short-term migrants, they have difficulty integrating, they may not have a formal documentation based on this destination. So these are some of the quotes from our field visits. So what we have found is that in terms of One Nation, One Ration Card, which is one of the few schemes that has a portability element attached to it, even that is not really working in favor of migrants. So the shopkeeper at the local shop is reluctant to give them, they prefer to give it to locals, or sometimes even sell it to some batter shops. Sometimes they are also losing out on benefits from the source. So housing schemes that might come into the destination, if they are not, sorry, at the source, and if they are not at the source, if they are migrating to city, then they are asked, why should you get a house in this source if you're not going to be there? So they are losing at both ends. So when you interact and layer all of this with the changing climate in cities, what we see is that is where the problems are worsening. So we have also mapped the hazards that are in the city. So the first map that shows is the kind of change in heat across a 20-year period, 2003 to 2023, and we see that most of Ernakulam district is actually showing a positive heating trend. The other image that we are showing is change in groundwater level in Bangalore. So you can see that most of the areas are experiencing a negative change in groundwater. So then all these interact at a scale, and when we are looking at migrants, we see that there is high exposure to heat, and sometimes they are heavily dependent on the welfare of their bosses or landlord, all of these to just even cope with these kind of issue. So one of the Bengali migrant we saw in a wholesale market in Ernakulam, the shop that I talked about earlier, which has no ventilation, he says that my boss is nice, so he has provided me with a cooler in addition to a fan. But there are others who are not so nice, where multiple people stay in the same shop and they don't have any ventilation. Sometimes they have some coping strategies. So houses build kind of extension out so that they can sleep outside, delaying their sleeping so that they are not so exposed to heat. Then the other crisis that we see is water shortage. So sometimes it's seasonal. So if you are looking at Bangalore's case, you know that last year we had both heavy heat wave that happened. There was water shortage, but then there was also flood in October. So in some settlements it's seasonal, but then some settlements they are facing it all year around. Sorry. So then there is sometimes we see that coping strategies like migrants pooling in to pay for tanga water, but then these prices are rising. Then, of course, we see urban floods. This was in October 2024. One of the settlement that we are working on got flooded, and some of the coping strategies include putting construction waste so that there is some, increase in their level that they are not immediately inundated by the flood water. So the last thing that we looked at was the intervention. So I will just summarize it. What we have found is that most of these interventions at climate and hazard level interventions misses out on migrants. Sometimes the alerts are in languages that are local languages, but then they are not getting it. The migrants are not getting it. They're facing discrimination in camps. Many schemes are not migrant sensitive and they are not recognizing the social vulnerability of migrants. The social protection and welfare schemes are again looking having criteria such as you need to have some proof of residence at the destination, which means that migrants are excluded and they don't have the political representation or the ability to hold governments accountable, so then they are not prioritized at the destination. So these hazards and these structural conditions are reinforcing the vulnerability of migrants in destination, and they are not adapting really at the destination. They are just managing to cope with precarity. Some are, but mostly what we are seeing is that they are coping, and this also has a knock-on effect on their ability to remit, which is a major thing that we are talking about in terms of migration as an adaptation. But there are also positive things, because I don't want to just talk about the negatives. We see that migrants are building social networks which are helping them to adapt to an extent, just like pooling in money. Then they are building sometimes social capital with their employers, which has some gaining them some support at the destination. Just like Sheetal said, they are building assets, livelihoods, etc. And there are some models by some NGOs and other stakeholders who are working that are showcasing what can be done at the destination for migrants. So to conclude, what we see is that at both destinations and source, that migrants are increasingly precarious, both livelihood and other vulnerability is increasing. And we also need to look at intersectionalities like gender, caste, and when we are looking at mobility decisions and outcomes. So while there is a positive potential for migration to be an adaptation to climate change, we need to examine the outcomes across spatial for source, destination, as well as across mobility. It's not that migration is an adaptation, but how staying is also an adaptation. So that needs to be considered, and then we can tailor effective interventions that are essential to actually leverage the adaptive benefits of migration both in rural and urban areas. Thank you.
Thank you so much. That was some very fast talking, but I hope people could catch it, and very nice to also see pictures from the field from both source and destination. Our last speaker is Nehal Ranjit from IIHS, and he'll be speaking about planned relocation in coastal India. Over to you, Nehal.
Thanks, Chandni. Good evening, everyone. So again, this is a part of the CLAPS project, and where we are looking at Chandni, Aisha, and Sheetal spoke about the mobility spectrum and how there's people who are staying on one end, and on the other end you have people who are moving. So that end where people are unable to move, often we find that an external party, which is most often the state, steps in to move certain people out from very precarious conditions, or from places where, due to climate change, the habitability of that particular place in itself becomes a question. So that is what I will be focusing on, where a state steps in to move people out. So uh, looking at that description of planned relocation, I would like to draw everybody's attention to three aspects on that definition. One is the idea of that it's a more or less a permanent sort of a movement, and that it is also both preemptive and also a response strategy. So in certain cases, you see some sort of relocation that happens after certain climate disaster events, and in some events, in some places, it's also done in anticipation of certain hazards and so on. It usually occurs at a community level, so to say that it's not very individualistic, so it's often a village or a group of village and so on that's usually being relocated. And like I said in the beginning, it often is under the control of the state with support from different funding agencies and so on, depending on the size and scale of these programs. And most often it occurs within national borders, and it's not to say that more international sort of planned relocation are not really thought of as not being happening, but largely we see such sort of programs happening within like national borders. And why something like this becomes prominent and like for India is particularly due to our very long, vast coastline, and a lot of it is also uh, under threat of climatic hazards. So we do face significant amount of coastal erosion. Particularly, our eastern coast is prone to a lot of extreme weather events like tropical cyclones and storm surges and so on. So, and the nature of some of these hazards is that it makes a lot of uh, coastal areas increasingly hard to uh, live in. And as a result of this, we have been increasingly seeing a lot more such climate related relocation projects being operationalized in the country, starting from say the 2004 Indian Ocean tsunami, and a massive sort of resettlement that has happened after that, to a lot of the Odisha disaster recovery project that has happened in Odisha post a lot of cyclones. So you see different scales of such projects also happening. So from such large scale projects to much smaller scale interventions where maybe a village is moved and not like the entire coastline. But despite its increasing employment as a form of adaptation mechanism, we currently don't have a comprehensive set of regulations or a policy framework to guide this process yet. But having said that, it is also important to point out that the idea of relocating and resettling people is not new to India. India has a long history of such sort of resettlement programs, starting from a lot of refugee resettlement programs that has happened. We have had a lot of resettlement due to like large scale infrastructure projects, particularly construction of big dams, nuclear power plants, and so on. We have also had such sort of resettlement within like cities due to either urban beautification projects. We have had a lot of slum clearance programs and so on. There has been a history of resettling people due to, again, like conservation projects, and a lot of post-disaster resettlement as well. So some of them are not necessarily climatic. So like the earthquake resettlement that has happened in Gujarat, and the Indian Ocean tsunami in the southern coast of the country. So not like beyond climatic hazards. Also, we have had such forms of resettlement and programs, and we also do have some amount of policy framework to guide that, especially the first three, and not so much on the disaster end. So we have a national resettlement and rehabilitation policy which came out in 2007. So history shows us that the policy was being formulated since the 80s, and it really took shape in like early 2000s. So that's also the scale that we are talking about, and the time that it took to develop such a policy that really dealt with those forms of resettlement. And when we come to resettlement for the case of climate change and disasters, we're still not there yet. So, having had a long history of such forms of relocation and resettlement, we also have had a lot of studies on it. And so, we do have a fair sense of a fair sense of idea on what's really happening. So what we know already about such sort of programs is it's often very deeply political, and in a lot of cases relocation and resettlement is also used as a cover to kind of further certain hidden agendas. And we see that increasingly in the case of climate change and disasters also, where climate change and disasters and the idea that the idea of risk reduction is used as a front to kind of further already political agendas of the state or like other vested interests. Most of the cases of planned relocation that we have seen so far are mostly coerced, involuntary, and it's very unlikely that the demand for relocation usually comes from the affected people or the community. I mean, not to say that it doesn't, but on the whole, it's mostly a top-down exercise with very little sort of interaction and consultation with the people, and that also leads to a lot of negative impacts. So what we know is when relocation are not like properly planned, you would have a lot of like a loss in livelihoods, because people are usually moved quite far away from the city or from their livelihood means. If houses are being built by a third party or like the state, it's often not to the interests and the cultural sensitivities of the people, which often leads to them not being utilized properly. And in a lot of cases, particularly in urban settings, we see that planned relocation where like people from different groups and different areas are being brought together without any sort of consultation in planning that habitat. There is a lot of conflict and violence and a break in social networks and ties. So these are some of the things that we already know about planned relocation. So this current study largely focuses on the state of Odisha, which is on the eastern coast of our country, and which has seen a lot of uh, cyclones, and also sees a rapid coastal erosion, particularly in like the northern districts, which is Kendrapada, and almost every year Odisha faces like an onslaught of at least 3 to 4 cyclonic storms. So the largest study looks at 4 such sites in Odisha, and they've all had like some form of adaptation intervention, be it a large scale planned relocation project or like the planned relocation project plus like some coastal hardening infrastructure like seawalls and so on. So I'm not going into all 4 sites for this presentation, and I'll stick to the first one, which is Satabaya, which is the earlier settlement, and the relocation site, which is Bagapatia, which is located in Kendrapada. So Satabaya, as the name suggests, also was a group of 7 villages on the coast, and currently much of the original villages have gone under the sea, and the coastal erosion kind of intensified post the 60s and around like after the 70s cyclone. So ever since then, the state has been, because it has seen a lot of casualty around those parts, the state was very keen on moving a lot of people out of that place. Also because the village kind of borders on around a national park, which is the Bhitarkanika National Park. So the place also has a long history of people refusing to relocate, and that also had to do a lot with the kind of places that the state was proposing to for the people to be relocated. But I think several decades down the line, around 2011 or so, the people finally uh, gave in to the idea of moving away, and it's mostly because of the kind of place that was chosen was still slightly more acceptable than the ones that earlier chose for people. And there was a package that was announced and so on. So given this particular Bagpatia resettlement project has the moniker, particularly in public discourse, as the first resettlement project for climate victims, and the people in Satabaya are often labeled as India's first climate refugees and so on. So much of what we see in the new resettlement site is kind of mirrors what we already know from our experiences with planned relocation. Badly planned settlements, the area that they have picked for relocation is still a very marshy, low-lying land, and that is why it's often inundated. And you see, and the financial assistance that people were given to relocate was often not enough, which is why you see a lot of half-constructed houses, because owing to the marshy nature of the land, a lot of money, a good chunk of the financial assistance was spent on like building these mounds, like getting the sand and preparing the land for construction, which left them with very little money to build actual houses. And in a lot of places, immediately after the rains, you see intense water logging. So this was still like a couple of weeks after a cyclone and so on. So, but you see a lot of water logging, and even year round, this was not during a monsoon season. A lot of their critical infrastructure, owing to the marshy nature of the land, is kind of immersed in water. So their schools, their public health centers, and so on are constantly submerged to some extent or the other. So what essentially happened is, at the pretext of moving people from like shifting, reducing their risk to one kind of hazard, which was coastal erosion, what has essentially happened is they moved people to a different kind of recreated the risk and shifted the risks elsewhere. Now they are more prone to flooding and so on. And apart from these material uh, shortcomings, there's been a lot of change in the idea of how they see a place. So the very fact that the place didn't have any trees, or that they didn't have flowers for their to perform their pujas and rituals, are some of the things that people hold very dearly. So it's around 2013 that they have moved, and now we are like 10, almost like, yeah, over 10 years after the whole relocation process has started, and still they do hold, there are like more than the material conditions that really uh, makes or breaks this new settlement for a lot of people. And you also see a lot of a loss in livelihood, because people were though this was a coastal village, people were not fishers by caste, they were mostly agriculturalists. So what has happened was people were not compensated for their agricultural land, so they were just provided land for housing. So which meant that again there was a loss of livelihood options, and that did trigger a lot of out migration from Bagbatia. But this is not to say that this form of migration did not come with its own benefits and positive aspects. What people what Aisha was saying, a lot of people from this particular place has moved to Ernakulam in Kerala, and a lot of them work in plywood factories there. The remittances that they have received for this has been used in for finishing the construction of their houses, accumulating assets, and so on, and also investing in alternate forms of livelihood. So what you are also seeing is one sort of an adaptation intervention, which was planned relocation, is also sparking a set of movement, which in turn also helps them adapt to the changing nature of that place. So it's a whole a step by step different forms of adaptation that we are seeing uh, here. So the kind of alternate livelihoods that have opened up is like people have it's also the ones that kind of support this whole migration ecosystem that's really booming right now. So in Satabaya, it's a very small village of around 500 households. What people say is that there are almost every household has somebody who has migrated, and a whole ecosystem of livelihood options have come around it. For example, there is like a kiosk, a small internet cafe and a kiosk that just manages remittances. So there is somebody here who manages the UPI accounts for UPI for people to send in money from Kerala. And because it's mostly like slightly older folks that were staying currently in the village who necessarily don't have access to smartphones and stuff, so they would deposit money here, and then they can withdraw money from their UPI account by paying like a small fee. Like they pay like 10 rupees for every 1,000 rupees of transaction. And so for even for a village of 500 households, the scale of transaction that happens is around 2 to 3 lakhs per month, which also kind of shows in the flow of remittance that's coming in. And another interesting thing that has come up is, so from Bagpatia and Kendrapada, there is a bus that runs twice weekly all the way to Perumbavoor. And this bus is interestingly owned by a group of young Odia migrants who have come together to purchase two such buses, and they have hired Malayali men to as bus drivers and helpers, and this bus goes twice a year. So the kind of migration here that we are seeing is slightly different maybe from what Anurag was presenting. I mean, not to say that that doesn't exist here also, but there is a lot of upward mobility and asset creation and also entrepreneurship that's being driven by this form of migration. So trying to unpack this idea question of planned relocation has at this point has left me with more questions than answers. So often a trope that is used to justify a planned relocation is always on a justice angle, saying that it's you have to do this because if uh, uh, people who are able to migrate do so on their own, and for those who are not able to do it, that's when the state should step in and migrate people. But what we are seeing here is, on one hand, climate related, this sort of planned relocation is exacerbating and creating new vulnerabilities like you're seeing in Bagpatia. But on the other hand, in the same place, it's also they do feel a sense of security and safety because their house was literally at risk of going underwater, and those fears have been allayed to some extent. So there is this sort of tension that exists there, but also the planned the relocation intervention in itself is also such a shock and a disruptor that has also in turn triggered some sort of transformations like the asset accumulation, investments in buses and so on. But I'm sure that that also does play out on existing lives of inequities and vulnerabilities that are there, and these are some of the things that we in our study would have to explore a bit further, because I'm sure that everybody who's migrating to Ernakulam to work in plywood factories are not able to purchase buses and so on. So there are a lot of other existing uh, inequities and structures that also facilitate some of them. Overall, what this is also for us, what this also brings into question is the idea of using planned relocation as an adaptive strategy is also brought into question, and maybe some of these things are what we hope to unpack when we finish our research. Thank you. I'm sorry for going over time.
Thank you so much. And thank you to all the speakers and to the audience actually for listening without getting a chance to speak a little further. And then we'll open up for questions. I'm really happy to actually now invite two discussants to maybe reflect on some of what you've heard, but I'd also just one of the things we're thinking of as you think about climate change and adaptation, which is reducing risks to climate change, and this reality of migration, mobility, staying, and immobility, is that this is a situation of livelihoods are precarious. People are sometimes moving out of precarity, moving into precarity. And then there are outcomes of this movement or staying, which is that people are able to manage risk better, building their adaptive capacities, and sometimes being able to do better in various ways, but sometimes staying in the kinds of conditions that Aisha was talking about, sometimes remaining in debt the way Anurag was sort of talking about. So to first to Aryan, who's from IDRC Canada, but also is a migration scholar for, I mean, so long, I would really just invite you to reflect on what they've said and what seems to me, on the one hand, this context of transitions, but also perhaps what are the ways forward? How do we really think about social protection when we're seeing this kind of flux and climate risks as intersecting with our development realities?
Thanks so much. That's really hard, and it's really hard because I just love hearing the fantastic work that's being done. Before I know it's on, I should look that way. Thank you. So I work for IDC, but I work on the program of climate adaptation and resilience, and with which is led by Manuela from FCDO, and I came into that program with that background on one being a fan of the work of IIHS, and a student of the work of Aro and David Satterthwaite, and working on migration, including in India. And I'm a student of history, and I want to preface that because one of the that's why it makes it a little hard to reflect on this, is that a lot of what I hear is not new, and maybe that reflects my age, but I think it's really important to remember that there was the data on half the households typically have now have a migrant. In 1900, colonial records told us that districts in Bihar, half the households had migrant. In the middle of the 18th century, people from North India moved to the very fertile fields. So you work. This is a very, I don't know if it's unique. I don't think it's a historical, but it's a very mobile continent that has colonial imprints, but it also has pre-colonial imprints, right? Because the 18th century records. So mobility is not new, and I think so my two comments are really comments on why it's important rather than what's coming out of it, because it's what I hear is so fascinating, and really not able to comment. First of all, I think it's really important to emphasize that mobility is not new, and one of the reasons of that is that, and you didn't comment on it, but I think the way that this research is positioned against some of the global analysis of this panic about waves of migration is really important, and you constantly position that work against that, and that is so important. And that panic about migration is really important because it influences policy globally and nationally, and people like Hein Haas have written about it, that is not just an academic issue, but it's a political issue. It takes away the agency of migrants, which is the core focus of this work. Understand what people do. It can easily lead to populist movements, which typically are anti-migrant. And I've always wondered why it's so important to think about, do we actually know whether there's new migration, more migration than there was in the past? And we don't know. The reason for that is not an academic question. The reason that we don't know if there is, I mean, there is more migration in certain contexts, no doubt, and you're pointing that out. But overall, in India, we don't know why, because we don't know how many migrants there are in India. And I definitely want to make sure that we continue to think about what happened during the beginning of the COVID pandemic here, where many migrants had to leave the city because they were in that precarity. And we didn't know how many people there were. The government didn't know. It's that invisibility of migrants that is really, really important. And that's what this work helps to do. Migrants are there. Maybe they're more, we need to understand where that migration movement is, what people do, and policy need to build on it. The second thing so the first thing is that invisibility that you're addressing. The second thing is migration by itself, I would say, is not an issue. We talked about your migration patterns yesterday, right? And when yeah, forget mine. That would the audience wouldn't get any. And when an educated migrant moves from MP to Bangalore, this is not an issue that is seen as problematic in right? When we talk about migrants and the problem of migrants, we typically talk about unskilled migrants, the folks that were invisible during the pandemic and for which no social protection was available at that point of time. And the work that NGOs did was absolutely heroic, right? During that in the pandemic, it was fantastic. It also fell far short of the needs. The systems are not there. So migration, in the way we talk about it, and again, what it is that you're addressing is it's typically about labor migrants, and it's like a mirror of the structural inequalities that exist, and that is really, really important. I think that's really, really important. Of course, we want to understand that mobility by itself, but we the program we work on, and what this project addresses is to think about how can we have to understand the vulnerabilities of the impact of climate change. We want to provide evidence that informs that inform policies that are inclusive as well as sustainable. And for that, we really need to think about what is vulnerability. We really need to understand it. And often, I tend to think it's slightly extreme. I think people are not vulnerable to climate change. People are vulnerable to the lack of institutions, and we have the solutions. The people are vulnerable to the lack of institutions that don't address that climate change, right? So it's understanding migration is like a mirror of those structural inequalities, and these are so important to understand to get to the kind of outcomes that we need. Thanks.
Absolutely. Thanks so much, Aryan. And I think this you reminded me of that a lot of this project, and therefore I think some of this evidence, is trying to really push back against the common global homogenizing narratives that are there around linking climate change and migration. So there's always this rush to sort of attribute how many people are moving because of climate variability and climate change, and less attention being paid to the fact that, as you said, migration is not new. Mobility has always occurred in the subcontinent. The conditions under which people are moving and the things they're moving into perhaps are being changed because of climate change. But there are lots of these underlying institutional, socio-economic constraints and hierarchies that are shaping a lot of these unequal outcomes for migrants. I'll now like to move to Manuela from FCDO, of course, also leads the Climate Adaptation and Resilience Program. And really, Manuela, give us a picture of how is all of this case-based work linking to broader conversations that are happening on adaptation and resilience?
Thanks, Chadni. Thanks for inviting me. I feel like really daunted with all you experts coming here and talk. So I lead on this Climate Adaptation and Resilience program, which is like a large program that look at climate adaptation and resilience in a particular way. And I'm going to tell a little bit about that a bit later, but I just wanted to put some of that in the context of why we are doing that in that way, and that links to why to kind of the international debate, but also what works and why those kind of localized case studies are very important. So at the moment, as Aryan said, migration is very high up in the international debates, and we know that there's something that has happened. It continues to happen. If you look at ourselves, we are probably all migrants at some point in our history, there is important to consider that as a phenomenon, but also thinking about on how that links with climate change, as well as how it links with another big phenomenon that is very much in the international debate at the moment, which is about urbanization and urban resilience. So this is another big hot topic at the moment. We have the special report on city that is part of the AR7 cycle that looks at urbanization, and so within that, how those factors interact and why they are important to be looked at in those lenses, and why looking at local level is very important to answer the kind of the big picture international level. So first of all, it is really important to think about those two dimensions, the kind of the high up dimension and the local ones, because first there are commonalities about some of those issues that happen at local level, but at the same time, it's very important to underline and recognize that the solution needs to be led by the specificity of the different realities. So in terms of commonalities, we see, first of all, that it's really important when we consider the urban resilience to think about that in the context of mobile population as well. And that's actually, it seems obvious, but it doesn't really happen. So we've heard before from Sheetal and Aisha that a lot of the climate resilience intervention don't even consider migrant population. That there is a lot of policies that think about kind of urban resilience that don't consider the informalities. which is for us is obvious because we walk in the street and we see that reality, but actually that doesn't happen. So it seems to be very fundamental an international debate recognizing that actually the urban resilience and the kind of the movement and the informalities and the people that kind of come in and out of the city is very is fundamental to be considered together. The other thing that I think kind of reminded this panel particularly reminded me is that a lot of the time cities and urban resilience are seen as an island. So urban resilience is the resilience of the city in the city. Cities are never an island, not only because people come in and out, because they get the resources from the outside and they ship resources out. So that's something that is so important from especially looking at international debate, never really to build that kind of the separation. Again, it seems obvious, but it does happen. People think about cities, and that is a policy for cities and not for wider. It's not simple to do because it implies thinking about the systems and thinking about the kind of the different levels, which brings me to the third kind of commonalities of kind of some of the cases we had today with the kind of something that happen in many other places, which is the importance of linking actions at different levels. So a lot of the program we work on, they specifically work on kind of empowering community to take action at very local level. And we heard some example, for example, about like what people can do to empower themselves, to shift their livelihood, for example. So this is a very localized action, very important, but it's not sufficient. So a lot of the time, the way that these programs work is that also empowering people to influence action at municipal and national level, and also working with municipal, national, regional actors as well as international actors to really shape the policies. Because there is, we heard before about the need of kind of the municipal land use planning is a huge driver of vulnerability, but also can be a huge driver of resilience. And we heard about the importance of also recognizing, kind of addressing migration into a national framework as well. That's a national policy. So all of these levels need to be linked to ensure urban resilience. So all of this, but on the other hand, and we kind of go back to the very local, as I said, solutions need to be built at the local level. So that's one of the key parts that we had just now on the example around relocation. Solution that works are those that are co-created with those involved, that kind of that needs to be kind of they are affected by this solution. So we call like kind of co-creation, bringing bottom up, which doesn't mean passing on the responsibility to them and just say, you build your solution, I step out, but it's really linking that and hearing their voices to bring them to the bigger forum and build those solutions. So all of these aspects, so the kind of this importance of considering the kind of the different aspects and the different vulnerabilities within the urban resilience, the importance of linking the different systems, so looking at different scales as well as different policies, and the importance of co-creating solutions are very much at the heart of the program, this program called CLARE, which is climate adaptation resilience. And I think that's this project, this work is a great example of this program. It's really embodied all of the different aspects. And it's, as I said, it's not often done because it's not easy. You look at kind of the systemic change, the transdisciplinarity, the co-creation, the linking. Also, another aspect that is very important is being aware of the political sensitivity. I mean, migration is hugely politically sensitive. We heard about that, but at the same time, one cannot move away from embracing that. So yeah, I think that's, I guess, all I wanted to say. And I'm very thankful for IIHS and the team working on this program.
Thank you so much, Manuela. And I think the reminder of taking a systemic approach, not looking at cities as these little islands in a vast countryside, which is often forgotten. I think that's exactly what we wanted to do with this panel, and sort of have this rural-urban transition in the title, also putting the attention on the fact that migration, the process of migration, is such a powerful metaphor, symptom of these connections between rural and urban areas. And so it allows us to move beyond just the rural or the urban, that those traps of binaries that we tend to fall into often. All right, so we do have a bit of time for questions. First, maybe people in the room, please raise your hands. Any questions to particular speakers? Reflections are also okay. But if there are any questions, I know it's been a long time since Anurag started in Tamil Nadu, but I hope you do have some questions for the different speakers. And please just say your name, also who you're directing the question to. Thanks.
I'm Nitya, and my question is to Anurag. I thought we'll start in this
Wonderful.
way. And I've also done work on climate, debt, and migration in Tamil Nadu. And so some of the kind of question observations I have, one of the things is, in what ways is the migration contract itself debt? Where you have the wage advance and contractor, and so you're is it a kind of zero interest credit that you're taking at that moment, and then you go and you pay it back by working? But it can also be debt in the sense that you don't finish it that work season, so you have to keep going back depending on how the calculations are being made. People can also take loans to migrate, maybe international migration. We've even seen this from very dry districts in Tamil Nadu.
Let's stick to the question, just because I want time for other speakers also.
Okay, a few other things that, like house construction, debt for that, but also because of flooding risks.
Yeah.
But then also to be able to take loans on the house. Then ceremonies as conspicuous consumption, but also as ways of saving. And so that it's a way to bring, there's a huge economy around the ceremonies themselves. And so you spend 10,000 on the thing, but it's a huge lakhs coming back. And
is there a question there? And then,
finally, a question is, you say self-help groups is a source of credit, but where are microfinance institutions? They are talking a lot about being designed for climate resilience in the last few years. And so if debt to them is rising, is that also a concern?
Thank you so much. Sorry for pushing you, but I just want to make sure they have enough time to respond. All right, maybe Anurag, over to you. Okay. You want to respond? While please, people, you can raise your hand while he's responding. I'll take note of that so the mic reaches you.
Thank you for the questions. So as far as the first question is concerned regarding migration contract and how, if there is any debt that they take during the initial movement when they migrate, that was our assumption. We thought that there could be a lot of loans or debt involved in people trying to move. We even in in the initial kind of, I think, first questionnaire that we kind of piloted in September of this last year, we had questions that we had put in asking, do you sell land, or do you take loans on your house, or do you take loans on your land or any other asset that you have to kind of move? And none of the respondents came back saying that they do that. So most of the debt that they accumulate is post movement to the destination. But there is a caveat again, because there are I think communities that, for example, Irulars and Dalit communities who migrate again to the sugarcane fields in Coimbatore to work. They take advances because again, it's more of a community issue here rather than how it operates, how this whole financial issue operates. So that's one thing. We do understand that ceremonies also are a kind of way in which there is some money that is coming back, but we have not seen that happening. Especially because the kind of ceremonies that we are talking about is also not weddings or, let's say, coming of age ceremonies or things like that. We mostly observe this in festivities. That's why I kind of stick to the word festivities more than weddings or other things. Why I'm saying festivities is because there is this new kind of money being pumped into the district by a lot of players, a lot of political parties also, for of course the reasons we know for. And But then again, how it is getting translated is that, for example, when some festivals you'll see huge celebrations that are not kind of ritualistic, or this is not the tradition that is followed in Tamil Nadu. So we see that happening again. We see that happening new. And there is a lot of money that is being pumped into that, and there is no returns. There is nothing. So these are all festivals that just go away. I'll just hand the mic to Sundar sir, who can maybe add on to.
Maybe that point about microfinance and SRGs. Yeah.
With continuing with these festivities, it's also kind of a competition that emerges in the villages. Like, so you put people into competitive mode, and therefore it escalates the expenditure. So very often we see the new youth who had made money in Bangalore or elsewhere, showing off their wealth. So that is one dimension. And also, like the story of bus, we also saw the other side in Dharmaburi, where you have the real estate value going up phenomenally high, sometimes at par with even Chennai. Some places were so expensive. And also kind of a proliferation of gold selling stores. Like, you name the brand, they are there. So this is again a phenomena within the urban areas of Dharmaburi. So you see both, so like money coming in a big way, also arrival of migrant workers from Bihar, Rajasthan, the Hindi-speaking area, not from Orissa, Assam, more. So you see that also happening. So they are occupying the new jobs that the industrial sites provide, and the new industries that are being tried out now. So this is the kind of pattern. And with regard to the microfinance institution, this Dharmaburi has been having a big history on that, and one of the reasons for debt itself is the microfinance institution. So they are in a serious debt, and the interest rates are so high, and there is no way of escaping it, because there's a cyclical process where you go into further debt, and you get into the trap, and that's for they are pushed out. So that's something which is happening in Dharmaburi even now. So that's despite the prosperity and other things coming through migration remittance.
Thank you so much. And I think this conversation really needs it's a panel in itself, because the promise of migration was always accumulation. And yet we see that migrants are not even, indebtedness, and then further, as we were talking over lunch, right? They're operating in minus. They're just trying to get to a zero. There's no concept or ability to move to a 1 and a 2. So I think the story of indebtedness and recurring indebtedness remains.
The situation is getting further aggravated with the animal thing. Like, you borrow money, you cultivate, just before the harvest, your crop is destroyed by the wild boars or the peacocks or the monkeys, elephants, bear. So I think some 8-9 varieties of invasion happens, and you have no way to handle it. And further, if anybody by mistake takes a step, then they are further penalized by the forest department. So they pay heavy penalty. Like, for killing one wild boar, they have to pay 1 lakh of rupee. Or if a peacock gets killed, you are arrested and blackmailed and all that. So it's a very complex situation these people are facing. So you have no way but to succumb to the whole situation and take it. So there are like stories where we came across people said that whatever is left from the animals is what we get. And then with this weather change, we saw recently that the whole other pests have come in, insects have come in. So the whole beans cultivation, the brinjal cultivation, the ladyfinger cultivation, all got destroyed with this thing. So it's happening that way. So you are in a big trap there.
Yeah. Thank you so much. Any more questions in the room? Yes, please.
I have a question for Sheetal and Aisha. So there are families and communities that seem to have both. So some of them migrate and some of them stay back. So some of them are stayers and some of them are mobile people. they both have to have different kinds of adaptations for their lifestyles. Does that create some kind of conflict among the communities or among the families as such?
Yeah, so it's not only just there are households with stayers and households with migrants. Within the household, you have some stayers and some migrants. So it's a very complex kind of a relationship, intra-household relationship that is going on there. But instead of conflicts, actually within the community, there is more of a aspiration, like because there is a migrant in the household and there are certain changes in the lifestyle and certain changes in how actually the mobility is happening economically and socially, there is aspiration happening among the other members of the community. Conflict as such we have not observed, but there could be other reasons for conflict, not really only related to because there is a migrant in the household, but also because of certain other things which come as a cultural remittance to the community that might be there.
Thank you. I have an eye on the clock, and that clock seems to be, I mean, it's not accurate. So I'm not going to stop people from coffee, and of course can continue to have conversations. I just wanted to put this up for if people are interested in learning more about some of this research, this website, and then of course we are regularly writing blogs and just notes from our field visits. So very welcome to look at it. Thank you so much for your attention, also to the people online, and yeah, we look forward to continuing these conversations. Thank you so much.